All right, we are live.
Okay, welcome everybody to this special documentation meeting for Backdrop CMS. We are recording this and streaming it, although I don't know if anybody knows we're streaming it, but we are. So if you want to mute or hide your camera, please do that now. I'm going to do a really quick introduction and then we'll introduce ourselves like we normally do. No, let's just jump to that right away. My name, we'll go do it as usual. I'll start and then I'll call on somebody else. Each person, when you introduce yourself, then call on the next person. My name is Tim Erickson. I'm up here in Deerwood, Minnesota, where we have about 8 inches of snow this week. So winter is officially here. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago I came to the meetings and said it would be the last time I could sit outside, and that seems to be bearing fruit. I am very much interested in documentation. However, I'm very much interested in everything. So I really want to be here for this discussion, but I'm not quite sure, given that I'm involved in the telemetry initiative and about a dozen other things. I'm not sure how much time I can put into this, but I'm going to help at least chair this meeting and figure out what our next steps are. Gregory, why don't you go next?
Hi, I'm Greg. I'm joining from Greece, usually in Australia, but now with COVID in Greece with my family. I'm interested in anything related to Backdrop, usually improving the user experience and core issues that make the admin easier for people to use. I'm passionate about also improving the help text, any help text that is within the admin interface, and I sporadically contribute to documentation. I would like us to become more efficient at doing that, and to also crowdsource that and allow the members of that community that are willing to do that to have an easier way to do it, to contribute changes to existing documentation or new documentation, and then have a process where we review, improve, and publish that. Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen Lampton. I am also really interested in improvements we can make to Backdrop itself that will make creating documentation in Backdrop better. And so learning here, like what our problems are and what we need to fix, and figuring out the solutions that we're going to figure out. And if it's bad enough that we can't use Backdrop, I want to make sure that we fix Backdrop so that it doesn't stay that way forever. So that's me. Let's see, Jeffrey.
Still can't hear you. Jeff, you seem to have unmuted, but we still can't hear anything.
Double mute. Okay, we're going to give him a minute. Matthias.
Hello, I'm Matthias. Can you hear me? Yep. I'm living in Switzerland and working with Backdrop and being part of the German-speaking community in Europe. And we have a discussion today or yesterday about creating videos and creating manuals and creating documentation. And for me, it's important to have the link to the official documentation things. And maybe how to separate things. Is training, is this documentation or not? Maybe you can give an overview of, I'm not very deep into that, to be honest. Joseph, yeah?
Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm a backend developer from Las Vegas, and I don't know, personally just here to listen and see how I can help, but I'd also like to kind of improve developer documentation because I've run into problems with views or entity API before, and I don't know, if I can help other people not run into those problems, then that'd be cool.
Well, Joseph, you're not muted, but I can barely hear you.
Oh.
Well, we could hear you, Jeff, so that's good.
Got that fixed.
Yeah, you can go now. You want to introduce yourself, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Portman, only Only my family and Arizona State University call me Jeffrey, so I can't change that. I am a Backdrop user, no coding experience with Backdrop aside from minor hacks, so I'm not a module translator guy. I'm mainly here to be the peanut gallery and to throw out suggestions. I haven't volunteered anything to the Backdrop project, so I'm happy to be a writer since I can't do the programming.
How about Sarvashri?
Okay, I'm a new Backdrop person and I'm interested in making Backdrop more accessible to new users. I'm in North Carolina, Walnut Cove, North Carolina, and I've written books before, so I have good writing skills and editing skills. So maybe I can be of use. I don't do programming at this point.
You've already started some documentation, haven't you?
Yeah, I started the Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Backdrop. Got a few pages, and it's an introduction to creating websites generally and using CMSs generally, and then getting into using Backdrop. So that's getting started. I don't know if that would be part of the actual documentation or if it might be a prequel for the documentation or something. Not sure where it fits in yet.
Luke,
Is that all?
Yeah.
Who's not gone yet?
Look, yeah.
Hey.
Luke? There you go.
All right. Can you hear me? I am Luke McCormick. I'm in San Ramon, California. I'm a web product manager. And I have a particular love for this topic. I actually, in my very storied and checkered past, at one point was project managing a book about Drupal, the definitive guide to Drupal 8 that was going to be on Apress, and went through the process, but eventually the project imploded. But nevertheless, I have lots of experience with what not to do, if nothing else. Also, I am, as everybody knows, project leading a initiative to try to get Drupal to Backdrop to be easier to use out of the box. And I know everybody's anxiously waiting for me to broadcast this, but one of the big conclusions I've come to is that a lot of what's necessary in that is actually documentation. Is that the vision I have is achievable, but it's just hard to find, and that a big chunk of the ready-to-wear deliverable is going to be a documentation. Say, do this, look over there, change these things. And, that may lead into, and probably will lead into, actual things that are, in the code, but the documentation is a necessary, critical, and really key piece of that whole thing. So I'm intimately interested in what's going on here today.
okay. So as I mentioned right before we started the video, one of the impulses I think for this meeting was the tools that we're using for documentation, and some suggestions that maybe we want. Most of our documentation is hosted on either Backdrop CMS.org or the API site for Backdrop, and there are some bottlenecks in terms of like how to contribute to Backdrop in that way. And so some people have suggested alternate tools. I think in the past, some of the pushback on alternate tools has been that Backdrop, we ought to be able to support that ourselves. And if we can't, we should fix that. So I think one of the things that we want to talk about today is whether or not we can get our current infrastructure, our current sites better equipped to manage documentation, or if we need other tools. What I just said reminds me of just a clarification I want to make, because when I first started doing Drupal and getting involved in documentation, I would bring up documentation to developers and realize that they were talking about something very different than I was. There's really two big categories of documentation for a project like Backdrop, and one is sort of documenting the code for other developers. And then there's sort of user-facing documentation on how to use the product. And I just like to be make sure that we're all clear about, I think both are legitimate topics for this discussion, but we should be clear about what we're talking about at any given point, because they are quite different. For example, a lot of documentation actually lives within the code itself. So as you're reading through the code, there are comments and doc blocks, just blocks of documentation within the code of Backdrop. And that's something very different than how to start layouts on backdropcms.org. So just be clear about what we're talking about as we go ahead. We have an agenda, if for anybody who's not aware, and it's a Google Doc, and it's mostly, I think, kind of a data dump of thoughts, ideas, links to related issues. I don't know if we've really thought through how this meeting should go. Why don't well, Gregory, do you want to say something about your own thoughts on this? Because I think it was you that sort of brought this issue up.
So some others before me have mentioned a few bottlenecks, like there's often contributing people, there are developers that have small complaints usually about the API. I should clarify that the API site in its most of it, what it does, it parses the documentation inline code, inline in-code documentation, and then it converts that into content for the API site, api.backdropcms.org. There are a few custom pages that where the content is being created manually, but most of it is being pulled from whatever is in the code. This usually is being managed in code, so developers have the opportunity to make pull requests in GitHub, and then that gets improved within the product, and then the API site automatically gets updated when we update that documentation. The other bottlenecks that I've seen is that people that are new to Backdrop and they face problems, and at some point they say, oh, I see that the community is active, I want to contribute, I want to update this documentation because this is not exactly, like this point is not exactly right, or you missed a point here and there. And then, of course, there's the multilingual members of the community, which say that we would like to have a place where we can either translate existing documentation, or we have documentation specific on creating multilingual sites, which is not always the first thought for people that their primary language, or the customers that they build sites for, their primary language is English. So these are the top things in my mind. I would like us to lower the barrier for people that want to contribute documentation, and long term, I want us, of course, to improve the documentation itself. The subject of what we use has come up many times. I don't have a hard preference. If we can make Backdrop as a product and the existing sites do what we want to do, I'm perfectly fine. We need to define workflows, permissions of what people can do and what cannot. So these are my thoughts. Some of the things that I would like us to discuss in this meeting anyway.
Okay. I had a thought, something I want to interject. I forgot. Jen, do you want to say something about your feelings coming into this meeting and what you want to get done?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of competing objectives here. The first one is that I want to make it easy for people who need to figure stuff out, how to figure, be able to do that without too much effort. And I know that our current approach to documentation is confusing and has been confusing for a long time. But I also want to make sure that we don't end up putting like additional burden of maintaining documentation onto maintainers. I think number one, they might not be the right people to write that documentation in the first place. And number two, they have enough going on where, merging pull requests for people updating READMEs maybe isn't the best use of their time. But trying to find a way to make it so that like we open up permissions on documentation, whether it's for contrib modules or core, whatever we want. And we can still sort of have everything in a structure that makes sense. You can manage it is really hard. And we can look at what happened in Drupal as an example, but I'm not sure that like we can point to anything that they said and said like, this is the solution, it's perfect. Or we could point to it and be like, that won't work. Like, I think I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like there are a lot of conflicting objectives here, and trying to figure out how to manage them is going to be really interesting. So I'm really curious to see what ideas other people have on how we can handle this.
Yeah, I think you're a tremendous source of wisdom on that, Jen B, because as such a long time community involvement in this whole thing, you'll hear lots of things that newer people will suggest that you'll be like, oh yeah, we tried that, and that's what Drupal Dojo was, or that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's that.
I think it might make sense to take just a minute and talk about what our current situation is. And when I talk about documentation, I'm primarily talking about user documentation. I'm the developer automated, the API site is not what I'm focused on right now. So in terms of user documentation, we have, I mean, there's a couple of things going on. First of all of our core documentation primarily resides on backdropcms.org. We have officially the user guide. Officially, like there's 2 or 3 different books within backdropcms.org, but I don't think you even have to know that to see that. I started a contributors guide, which doesn't have much in it. But anyways, they're basically the book module and book pages on backdropcms.org. And I think the problem that is really generating this meeting is if, say, Jeff is new to the project and he comes along and he wants to use field blocks in Backdrop and realizes that the documentation isn't very good. And he says, I want to write some documentation for that. What do I do? We don't really have, our current, I think, status would be, well, if you have an account on backdropcms.org, you can add, I think, I'm not even sure if this is true, that he might be able to draft, can't even draft a new book page?
No, you need to be an editor.
Okay. So we'd have to give him editor permission to edit it. And as a begin, really, like you could edit a new page and unpublish it. But if you wanted to edit an existing page, there's no real way to like make some changes and then wait for somebody else to approve them before you publish them. You kind of have to hit the publish button or not, or you'd literally be unpublishing the existing page. I suppose you could create a new page.
Revision. I think there's revisions enabled. So I haven't tried it, but they should be able to create revisions, but not publish those revisions. I think draft revisions. I'm not sure.
Okay. See, well, this is part of the problem. So we don't have
exactly.
a good workflow. Go ahead, Jeff. Unmute yourself.
The problem is that when Zoom doesn't have focus, the space doesn't work. I think, as the prototypical recent newbie and current intermediate guy, there's some decisions that have to be made on committee before we should start talking technical implementation. You don't want any Backdrop user to come along and write documentation, or you're going to end up with a holy mess.
Right.
And one of the points that I have to make is that there are structural changes I would suggest to the documentation project that if you go straight into the technical, anybody can edit, you're not going to have any structure at all.
Right.
My overarching problem with Backdrop, which actually made me move away from it a year ago and then came back to it later, was that all the documentation stream mixes end user stuff with intermediate stuff with developer stuff. That's true in Zulip, that's true in the documentation, that's true in the forums. The second problem is that there are too many places to look. So the heuristic that I just wrote down is the 3 levels of working with Backdrop, and remembering that people like me are confused by the idea of using GitHub as a documentation site. I think it is a place where you put code, and I don't really understand that part either. The 3 levels are: what can you do in the web interface without touching any of the files that live in, that you need SSH into to do anything with? What can you do with those files directly just by editing what's already there? And what do you need to be writing your code for? Those are the 3 levels of Backdrop. Like I didn't know when I showed up that I couldn't just use Drupal modules and that I'd have to migrate stuff, which for me means I can't do it at all. So if there is a documentation where the first page says, here's what you can do within the web interface. And if you don't leave the web interface, you just can't do it. But at the bottom page, there's a link to a second page that says, here's what you can do if you're editing the code with SSH into your server. And on the bottom page, it says, and here's where you need to go to become a programmer or find a programmer to get this done. And then there's the hierarchy. And people can choose, okay, I can start with this one page, go to a second page where I know where to go, and then use the third page to say, and here's what I just can't have as a requirement or as a request until such time as I hire a consultant or get somebody on the Zulip to do it for me. So that's a lot of work to break it down that way, and it requires 3 times as many pages. But once the structure's in place, at that point you can open the gates and let people like me come in and edit the documentation, because I know what I can't do, and so I've got a much easier heuristic for what goes on which page than you do, because I think a lot of people within Backdrop, this community, the people who show up at these meetings, I think a lot of people have forgotten where those lines are drawn because they're so adept at the most advanced stuff. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, thanks. So I would like to say that for each documentation, we have the option to provide a documentation level and a documentation status, as in if it's beginner, introduction, whatever it is. Do people generally find that helpful?
I certainly would have when I got started.
Yeah.
We could do, a lot of the conference sites have like a track and then a difficulty. So you can have like theming beginner, theming intermediate, theming advanced. So we could just have 2 fields on our documentation pages. It's like, this is like an advanced page, and just kind of automatically separate them based on those fields.
We do already have that, but I think we added it like long after most of the documentation was created. And so a lot of pages haven't been categorized, only like new ones that have been added.
Okay.
Yeah, we have. Sorry, go ahead, Luke.
All right. There's another problem that shows up a lot that we just experienced in Badcamp, which is that I've noticed that people are broadly really bad at categorizing how hard things are, and with Badcamp it was hilariously almost anti-predictive. Like the things that were tagged as beginner were often like incredibly deep technical things, and the stuff that were tagged as advanced were often introductory, things you could just breeze through. So there would have to be some kind of like 3D check on that to make sure that it's consistent enough to be useful.
So I would say that we could designate a person or a group of people that goes and takes care of that, but defining the criteria of what is easy, introductory, or advanced is a bit difficult. Long term, I know that it might be a more difficult solution. Long term, if we can get a solution that says, I read this article, this was hard, this was not, that would get us an idea of people, just like 100 people read this article and they found it hard. So you know that we don't even have to fill in fields, right? Jeff, sorry, you raised your hand. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to suggest my heuristic. If you can do it in the web interface, or you can do it with basic HTML and CSS, it's beginner, because you can expect most people who are coming to Backdrop have the HTML and CSS skills. If you need specific Backdrop understanding to edit existing code, it's intermediate. If you need to write code from scratch, it's advanced. And if there's an introductory page to the manual, it makes it very clear, here are the 3 heuristics we're using. I certainly would not recommend crowdsourcing, whether people think it's basic, intermediate, or advanced. You could crowdsource. I found this too difficult or too easy for me in terms of the quality of the page, and that means that we come back and edit it. But you don't want to have the heuristic being crowdsourcing as to where it's basic, intermediate, advanced, because then you have the same problem where the people who are adept say it's basic and it gets voted down, and then people like me show up not even knowing that you have a heuristic system and get completely lost.
I'm definitely wanting to jump in because I feel like Jeff nailed it, except we can just make that one step shorter. And I want to throw this out actually as an actual proposal. That rather than have a heuristic that says, if you know this set of prerequisites, then you are beginner, intermediate, leveling. Just drop that second part and be like, have a set of tags that says what your requirements going in is, like if you know basic HTML, that's all you need. And then we can kind of crowdsource people trying to do some, trying to follow something and saying like they got to some part in the documentation and it was spitting words at them they didn't understand. And they could just report, I don't know what a "the" is. And then we can put that in as a prerequisite and people can self-select the things that they're ready for.
So
Go ahead.
Sorry,
okay. So one thing about the ratings on sessions at camps is that there's whoever's presenting it decides what its level is. And I think that if just having multiple editors would probably mitigate this, because one person can write it and say, I think it's at that level. And then someone else will like, well, actually this is at that level. So just having more than one person being able to edit the pages, I think would mitigate that a lot.
Yep. So I want to jump in here on process and say we've identified some problems. We've only got 20 minutes left in this meeting, 25 at the most, and talk about what our outcomes for this meeting should be, because I think we're not going to solve this problem. I think one thing we've identified is that there was, we don't often get 7, 8 people to show up for a special meeting, which indicates that there is a level of interest in this. But two, I think the most valuable thing that can come out of this meeting today is like how to proceed. And so that's what I'm really looking for, I think right now, is how do we solve this problem and how do we make the decisions? I do want to say, I feel like it's worth getting on the table, like what tool we choose. Are we going to stick with backdropcms.org? I don't think we can solve even that today, but we can at least move in that direction. And for those, because some people on the call might not be aware, I think this came up because there are certain tools that are specifically designed for like collaboratively creating documentation for software projects. And so when we talk about things like just adding edit access, that's not necessarily what we would need to do. We can either figure out a better process in our current tools, or we can look at external tools. And there's tools like Read the Docs, and GitHub has some special documentation tools that allow for sort of editorial workflows where people can submit changes, have them reviewed. You can create a structure and those kinds of things. So just to make sure everybody's aware that there are different options out there, our question is, which one do we want to use, and how do we make that, even more important, how do we make that choice? Go ahead, Jeffrey.
I would say for the new user experience, you want to use Backdrop only because I read documentation before I decide to use the tool. And if I come to your documentation site and you're not using Backdrop, I'm going to wonder why the hell why. So purely as a marketing standpoint, you need to eat your own dog food. And I mean, I love Jen's idea about if there's a problem that you need to solve, well, then you know what you have to solve by the fact that you can't do what you want to do.
So I agree with all that, but if we need to solve problems, it means that we need to solve the problems before we can start allowing people to provide documentation. And I would like to address that. Having said that, I mentioned already that I'm not married to the idea of using a third-party tool. I also like improving the product that we have so that it can accommodate doing documentation, and I would love that. I mean, Drupal has been doing it successfully, but there's decisions that need to be made, and I'll get back to the point that Tim was making, targeted, like geared towards getting a battle plan out of this meeting. But one thing that we need to keep in our head is that we need feedback as well, and we currently, we don't have the required workflow process baked in Backdrop core. So we don't have the workflow that D8 and D9 has, where you can specify states of the document, like this is a draft, this has been reviewed, it goes back to draft, or it goes to under, I don't know, approval, and then approved and then published. So we don't have this sort of like more complicated or advanced workflow process that we might need. And what we do have is a way to provide feedback, which is comments. We just need to decide whether we enable comments on documentation or not, which is something that Drupal, again, they've done it. And I think that I took a look last week, and they've done it successfully now. One of my most prominent objections to that is that if you have documentation and then you have a series of like 50 comments, then it becomes hard and convoluted for the people that are looking at the documentation to find out the status. We have some sort of solution to that because we have this documentation status tag that says no known problems or it needs an update. So we have a way to tag documentation currently. We need to allow people to tag the documentation as, this needs documentation and provide feedback. That's a separate issue. But what I've seen in d.org and I like is that there's a separate section, like you click the comment or contribute, I can't remember what the link is called, and then you're taken to a separate section where you can discuss, I think it's called discuss this bit of documentation that you're looking at. So I would like us to enable comments and also hide them if possible from the person that is actually viewing the end product of the documentation.
I actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, I actually implemented this on my website. And I don't know what I'm doing in Backdrop. Taxonomy to say whether it's draft, in review, etc. And then there's a couple different permission user roles. There's one that can see comments, there's one that can add comments, and there's one that can edit the page. So the average authenticated user goes to the page and they never see the comments. You have to be, you have to have the status to even see the comments in the first place, and then it's all on the same page.
Yep, cool. Yeah, I think we can solve all those issues. But back to Tim's original suggestion is that we need to specify a matrix of what we expect, like what features. This is what we've done where we chose Zulip. We specified what we need out of it. We did a market research, and then we found the tool that best fit what most people wanted out of it. So if we can build a list of what we need out of the documentation as features, and then if Backdrop ticks all the boxes, then we can use Backdrop, even if that means that there is a checkbox with some work involved. That's my opinion. Like, I don't know what others think about that.
Well, I think the other the concern I have about the eat your own dog food thing is all about resources, and it's a good sign that we have a bunch of people here today that are interested. But it's been at least over a year since somebody first brought up the whole idea of like moving to Gitbook, and some feedback was, well, we should eat our own dog food, and it's been over a year we've been living with this problem and not making any progress. So
also that issue, like, it didn't start with what the problem was. It started with recommend a solution. And so none of us really know, like, why would we move to Gitbook because we don't know what the problem is we're solving. Or I think if there was an issue that's like, this is a problem that needs to be solved, that's something we might have been able to work on. It's actionable. Yeah. So I think like just pointing to the issue and saying it's been a year isn't necessarily.
Well, that my point was not that means that we can't do it. It just means that it isn't enough to say we have to eat our own dog food, right? We need a plan for how to eat our dog food. So that was the point I was getting at. So if we've got a plan on how to do that, then that's great.
I'll jump in as an outsider for most of these meetings. You're having a special meeting about documentation, but you have a regular meeting about outreach and getting more people to use Backdrop. So if you do anything with the documentation that lowers the number of people who come to Backdrop, you got one project that is counteracting something that's a regular ongoing proposal. So I would argue. I mean, I've got no idea if I'm going to have if you even want me to have a role in this organizational part, because I think that should be done by the people who are doing the most work. But the heuristic idea and the eating your own dog food, I mean, like if I'm coming new to the project and seeing what you've done, then I know what Backdrop can do. And the reason I left the first time is because I came in from the marketing materials with a set of expectations that were too high. So, which were then met 6 months later. So, one of the expectations I would have is that I need to know whether I can write documentation on my site. And if the documentation on your site is not written in Backdrop, I'm going to see that as a flaw in the software. So I mean, what it comes down to is that I think what Greg said is you can set your requirements as you like, but you can also decide that here's the requirements we can meet, and here are the ones that are a little bit too perfect for us. Let's just do very good, because then we can stick to Backdrop.
Well, I think just about everybody that suggested we use another tool has also said that they'd prefer to use Backdrop if we can. So I do support the idea of like trying that. And that seems to be where this is going. I think what Jen has identified is the weakness to what we haven't done in the past is identify, here's what we're looking for in a documentation system. Gregory dumped some great stuff. Not so much, well, you phrased it, Gregory, in the agenda as Gitbook features. Although as I look at those, a number of those are features that I think we want, right? And if we could have that list of features, this is what we want our documentation workflow to look like. I think we can make that happen in Backdrop, and it could be, some of it's going to be just implementing things we already have on backdrop.org, but we might actually have to make some feature requests to Backdrop Core, which would be great, because I think that it would motivate some of our core developers to be working on features that we ourselves need, and that we have a clear use case for. So
it's not only it might not be core features requirement. It might be customizations that we need to implement in Backdrop CMS specifically. So I was thinking how we lowered. This is what I noticed, the pattern that I noticed. We have new comments because there's a spree of interest because of the end of life of D7, and people are coming in, they're looking for documentation, they're going through the documentation, reading it, they find it useful, but they say, oh, you're missing this bit, or this is not entirely accurate, or you need to fix that. And they also sort of like provide feedback, but they do that on Zulip, like on our chat system. Now, it takes some effort for people to register for a chat. So I'm assuming that there's a larger amount of people. I'm not saying if it's big or small, but there's more people that read the documentation and they see something wrong, and they could have contributed, but we don't have a lower barrier. So if we have separate, I agree with what Jeff suggested, that we can specify different roles, right, with different permissions of who can edit and what they can see. But seeing the backdropcms.org, from my perspective, that I have full permissions, I see that there's an edit link, so I know that I can edit this. If we provided that edit link, but for anonymous users, it didn't take them to the edit screen, but it said you need an account and you need to go through this process to get approved so that you need to get a role, something like that, like a rough idea. I need people to provide feedback on what is wrong with the documentation, and if they are willing to take one step further and say, oh, this is just 3 words that I need to change and I fixed it, I could have done it, I want to contribute. I want us to lower the barrier of the steps that they have to do to create accounts and edit the documentation into a draft which we then can review. I would like us to get there, to that point. Whether that's things that will be useful for core, or it would need to be customizations for backdropcms.org, I don't particularly care. I just want us to get there.
I think you need to understand that most of your users, I'd say 95% of them, have zero interest in volunteering for the project.
Agreed.
The only reason I'm here is because all of you have been so damn responsive on Zulip to solve my problems that I feel an obligation to contribute back to the project. But if that were not the case, I would just be a Backdrop user and have zero interest in being here. So, I would argue that you need a footer on every page in the documentation reminding people Zulip exists, the forums exist, here's what's searchable, here's what's not. That's the stuff that every user needs to know. Once they're in the forums, now they're a member of a community as opposed to just a user. And once they're a member of a community, that's when you can convert them into volunteers. But you're not going to do it cold from somebody who's just reading the documentation. And you probably don't want to, because they're not part of your culture yet. They have to be part of the...
Yeah, that's actually a very good recommendation. A tiny block above the table of contents or the user guide thing that says here's a link to the forum, here's a link to the chat. If you didn't find what you're looking here, ask us there.
Okay.
So that's a wonderful like solution to get people involved.
So let's talk about what the process is here. And I mean, the range is just that one or two people go off and work on this. The other is that we create an initiative, sort of at the backdrop core level, or at the organizational level. Another might be a sprint day where we just kind of sprint on documentation, and some of these things could be combined. For those who aren't aware, like one of my concerns about this meeting is that this is such a big project. We went through a process 6 months ago where we identified a couple of initiatives which were important for the project, and they're the project Luke's managing, Ready to Wear, and the telemetry were the two things we decided to focus our energy on. I'm trying to focus right now on that telemetry project, and if this comes up, you know, I don't want it to like undermine the other initiatives. So like one of the things to know is, but I think it could be a third initiative. The question is, do we have the people and resources to keep it going without, or do we want to change our focus, which we could also do. We could also simply decide maybe this is more important than telemetry or Ready to Wear.
I don't think that necessarily we should limit the initiatives. The number of initiatives we have people like I mean, Jeff just said that he feels compelled to contribute back, so he can be an initiative lead for the documentation. If sorry, I'm putting you on the spot now, but a way to contribute is that we set a specific special meeting like this one, if not every week, every 15 days, or it could be every week, right? And everyone who's interested shows up. But then, Jeff, if you have the capacity and we accommodate like your schedule, your weekly schedule and your work or life, then you can lead that, which is you don't need to do things, you just need to push people so that they can do things. Remind us that we need to do things. So if that's something that you're interested in, we'd love you to help us on that. And I think that there's so many more things that we won't make to discuss in the next 5 or 10 minutes that yes, we need another meeting such as this. We need to specify goals. We need to set a course on doing that.
I think that having a barrier where you have to go to another place like Zula to enter in things and to sign up to change things is too much. A lot of times I'll go to websites or go to, you know, some documentation or something. I see words spelled wrong. I see something happening, but it's too much to try to figure out how to fix it or how to make a suggestion. So I think in the documentation, there needs to be some way for anyone, whether logged in or not, to click on something, say, I have a suggestion, here's my suggestion. It doesn't go anywhere, but it's moderated somewhere where somebody could go through it. If it gets garbage on it, you know, it's easily cleaned up. But then things could be changed. Somebody, it's just an editor, could fix simple things, a lot of things like that. And a lot of times I never contribute to or even give feedback to companies about their products or web pages or anything, because I have to sign in, I have to put in a password, I have to, you know, go through 3 or 4 different steps in some other location, and I'm just not going to do it, even though I see what could easily be fixed. So I think there should be something on the documentation pages, you know, I think I see a problem, click it, and be able to put something without even being anything other than an anonymous user.
So what I'd like to do is ask what people's interest, get a gauge of how interested people are in this and how they feel like they can contribute, so we know what kind of resources we have. And I'll just start. My own sense is that I'm very interested in this and would like to be involved. It's just, I'm trying to prioritize what I'm doing, and I've sort of committed to other things in Backdrop right now. So I'd love to see other people take this on. I would love to, I can attend some meetings and help out here and there, but I can't have this sort of fall on my shoulders to spearhead. So,
can I ask something? Please interrupt me if this has been discussed before, but if I had to solve the problem, I would go to a colleague from the Joomla community or WordPress community, whatever, and ask him or her, how do you solve that?
Mhm.
For me as an outsider, it sounds like a pretty common problem in every project similar to Backdrop. Has this been done before, or should we do this? Or what was the status here?
So I attended a session at a conference that was specifically for like nonprofit software technology, and there were a whole bunch of open source projects in there. Some of them were like WordPress or CiviCRM, some of them were Drupal and Backdrop. But it sounds like every community has the same problems, and nobody really has a perfect solution. And that might be that there is no perfect solution to this problem. But there's definitely like some people felt like they had things that were working and things that weren't working. And I think that maybe what we should do is build the list of like what works in what community, and see if maybe we can't find something that could be a really good parallel for us.
Mm-hmm. Because there's a rule, never start with the technology. But in this case, for me, I can't define the requirements. I simply don't know. Maybe this could be a case. Yeah, sorry.
I think that you can help. Even if you can't define them, you can help. Like you would express your opinion in this group, and we would translate what you say into bullet points of what we need.
Mm-hmm.
Right, these would be the requirements. So you're part of like myself, a multilingual community. So one requirement would be that I would like to easily translate a page that is on backdropcms.org. I would like to translate it to my language. So we need content translation enabled in backdropcms.org so that we can do that. We need a translator role which can do translations, things like that, right? If you specify what the goal is or what the need is, we will accommodate, like we will find the technical steps required to make that change.
So we're adding on the list of things that we could or should do. I want to know who's available and who's motivated to do it.
I can take next. So I'm also interested, but I tend to be drawn towards core issues, and I am advocating for some of the issues, so I can help with this and I can attend all meetings, but I wouldn't like to be the lead on this one.
If I can make a suggestion, I'm hearing two different sets of requirements here, not one.
Mhm.
We have a set of requirements for the end result of the documentation, and a set of results and a set of requirements for the tools you use to build the documentation, and they feed into each other because the tools you use are going to determine who can edit, who can comment. I mean, the tools feed into the end result. The end result feeds into the tools, but those are two different processes.
Yeah.
So since Greg put me on the spot, I can organize I'm happy to host an outcomes meeting, which would discuss the documentation and not care about the tools, during which time the tools requirements people should be dormant until they have that document. Then the tools people take it and the outcomes people go dormant. And then after the tools people have a result, there's one big committee meeting where everybody says, okay, we're happy with this.
That's good.
It's good enough. Now I can start with that outcomes process with the people here who are interested and whoever else we can recruit. But I can't do this quickly. I have zero bandwidth right now. So what I'm also hearing from this discussion is that people want this as soon as possible. At the same time, they want it very thought out with market research and all sorts of prerequisites to doing this process.
We also want it for free.
Yes. So somebody here needs to, and when I say somebody here, I mean the people who are in charge of the project. I mean, the people who I think of as are the people who are the most active on Zulip. The developers, the designers, the coders, those of you who consider yourself to be on maybe you have an official backdrop committee that runs the program. You guys decide first what your deadlines are and when you want this done. And Jen, you said last week that you've got a 2.0 in the future. Maybe that's when you target the really perfect system exists when Backdrop 2.0 comes out. And then we have benchmarks in between now and then as to what is built in the process. Once I have a deadline, I can tell you yes, no, maybe I can take on that responsibility. Certainly I can host a meeting, but I'm guessing not until mid to late November, just based on what my current schedule is.
Anyone else in the group want to say what they're prepared to volunteer doing so that we know about resources?
I'm pretty good at language and writing and editing, but I don't know all the content to put in it, so I can't write it from scratch because I'm not a proficient user yet even.
But you're good. You'd be excellent for the outcomes committee because you can, like me, come in and say, here's what I found was deficient, and so this is what I need, well before you're in the process of writing it. And I should add, I've also written books. So Sarvashri and I are in the same boat. I apologize, I mispronounced your name. We can be the writers at the end of the process. The beginning of the process, though, as I see it, is people who are newish to Backdrop and do not know what we're asking for start making the requests, and then the tools committee can decide what's necessary from that.
Yeah, what I find in looking at the documentation so far, and it's true of almost everything that I look at, it assumes that you have more knowledge than you do if you're a new user. And for instance, just the idea of building web pages generally is where I started to look at this. If I'm a new user and this is a new tool, so there's two groups of people. One are new users to the idea of creating web pages, and then there are people who are new to Backdrop, but they're not new to creating web pages. So they already have lots of experience to draw on. They know what they're doing and know why a page should be what it is. They know about hierarchy of menus. They know about various things that are common knowledge to them and pretty straightforward to them, but not straightforward to people who are new to creating web pages. And I see that to get a lot of people using Backdrop who might otherwise get stuck with WordPress would be to make it such that it's easy for them to see how they get from nowhere to a completed web page.
Well, I'm desperately trying to restrain myself from volunteering for anything until I've delivered the thing that I'm overdue at the moment. And we're out of time now for this directly. Yeah. But I want to throw out, besides just being interested in this, there's lots of overlap with what I'm doing. Like there's a big documentation component to the thing that I'm doing. So I'm happy if anybody wants to is feeling the urge to get involved with something. Like I'm actually doing stuff today involving documentation that will be relevant. So if anybody wants to just be on the feedback list, just tell me if you think something sucks, and that would be helpful.
Okay.
Let me know.
Can I interrupt and try and sum up, because I think we have some possible steps forward, and we're running out of, and we're out of time. So it sounds to me, first of all, I think we've already seen a lot of data dumped into our Google Doc. So we've made, just from this meeting alone, we have more than we've had before in terms of what our options are, what we're looking for. But I agree with, I like what Jeff was suggesting. I am very impatient, so it's always hard to talk about the next meeting in late November. But to me, that it exactly addresses my concern, which is that we keep this sort of realistic with what our resources are. So I would propose, and it isn't like work stops between now and November. If we did that, I like your idea about having a meeting that focuses on the specs, and the outcome of that meeting is maybe content and process specs. I don't know. You can offer some feedback on that, what the process should be to create documentation and what we want in it and how to structure it. Is that, you can just nod, or is that sort of what you had in mind? Okay. You're muted.
You're muted, by the way.
I apologize for the end of November estimate. I'm just looking at, there's an election coming up that I'm volunteering for, and I have to get out at least 2 and maybe 3 mass emails to our mailing list for my nonprofit, plus the work I do for a living. So, close to Thanksgiving is probably the first time it's going to let out.
That makes total sense to me. Don't apologize.
If you can find somebody else to chair that committee, though, I might be able to participate. I just can't do more than that between now and then.
Yeah, what I wanted to add is this doesn't mean that nothing happens until then, right? Because what we should have some Google, we have a Google Doc, and we could do more. in terms of allowing people, places to dump their ideas and their input between now and that meeting. Also, this doesn't mean that we can't make incremental improvements in what we currently have. You know, like I'm sure Jen is already thinking about things she can do to backdrop.org based on the feedback from this meeting. And I don't think we have to wait until this meeting is done to make little improvements.
Yeah.
So we can go ahead and start making improvements now. They won't be, they shouldn't constrain the discussion that happens later, but they should just be the things that we're doing now. And then, you know, after that meeting, I like the idea about it might be a different group of, I know there are some people who would love to help make this technologically better, but don't have strong opinions about the final outcome, right? They want to write the code. So I think your idea, Jeff, about, you know, mapping out where to go and then turning that off to the people who need to implement it makes sense. So
should we close this by deciding a date when we set up a second meeting then? Because that seems like a reasonable thing to do.
It could be. I mean, it's a smart thing to do. Jeff, does that seem realistic to you to like try and put something on the calendar?
Well, if we have a second meeting like this one, where we're just sort of talking in general, then in between now and the end of November, then I can, my next to-do list is just show up at the next meeting.
Yep.
And then at the next meeting, I'll expect somebody to tell me who's on, I guess, my subcommittee. And then I'll organize a Zoom for that group. And we'll go off and do our stuff November and December and come back and report to you.
Yep. Sounds like a plan.
I also
So
think one thing,
Sorry,
Jeff, you mentioned earlier is that we have this outreach meeting every week. It would also be great if we could get documentation back on the agenda for that outreach meeting, just so that we can, like, is there anything we need to do before the next X? We can revisit that regularly. So.
And I know the team mentioned it, but this, without having an official decision, this sounds like an initiative. So we've made it an initiative, I think, accidentally.
Okay.
So
Well, initiatives are approved by the PMC, but I support, and that doesn't mean that we can't do this work anyways, but I do support that we do that we make this an official initiative, but that will require PMC approval. But the work can happen either way. It's just giving it the PMC stamp of approval is good.
We're going rogue in the meantime before we have approval. Can somebody remind me, when is the outreach meeting? Because I should probably attend one or two of those in addition.
Every other Thursday at 12, starting next week.
Right.
Okay.
So this week is usability. Go ahead. Go ahead, Matthias.
Speaking of outreach meeting, I think I'm better in focusing on outreach issues right now. I'm too far away, not close enough to the documentation thing.
Okay.
Maybe come back later, but focusing on outreach. Starting next week, right, Jen? Yeah.
29.
So I'm going to suggest one that yes, documentation be a part of the outreach, because it is pretty, like, that be a place where we check in. Maybe not where the bulk of the work is happening, but at least we're keeping up to date with it there. And maybe keeping the process moving. So Jeffrey was suggesting another meeting before this bigger meeting. So just like in 2 weeks, or should we just do this at a documentation meeting? The next thing. Anybody?
Yeah, I think that we either next week, if people agree that this should happen on Thursdays along with the other weekly meetings, we should do it either next week or the week after that, if people need more time and the schedules are busy.
Well, I'm questioning whether it needs a meeting of its own or if we should just wrap it into a current outreach meeting, which would either be next week or 3 weeks from now.
I think we should definitely check in next week and see, like, based on what we did today, if we make any changes between now and then, it would be good to talk about them. But I think it's going to need more time than just being a part of a bi-weekly meeting. And so allowing the subcommittee to do what they do on their own schedule would be good too.
Right. Yep. Let's do that. Let's check in next week at the outreach meeting about process and see if we can't cover what work needs to happen in scheduling that larger meeting. But eventually there will be a meeting on its own. I agree. Okay. So a week from Thursday at actually this time, whatever time it is right now, that's when the outreach meeting would normally start. So
Yep. Let's decide for another meeting on the
it's
outreach meeting next week. Yeah.
that meeting starts at noon Pacific time, and whatever. So I think we should adjourn this meeting, because this week we have a usability design meeting that is already 10 minutes overdue.
Okay,
So does anybody
let's
have
do that.
any urgent things before we close? No?
Just thank you for putting up for my talking so much. And I didn't expect to get drafted, but I think I can be useful.
Well, we really appreciate it, Jeff. It's always good to see new faces at these meetings, and we appreciate your willingness to help out. And we'll try not to overload you.
Yeah. Call my drafting, overzealous outreach. So
Okay.
there you go.
Jen, do you want to